Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, he's an NBA podcaster, but his first book is a baseball one, a baseball Gaijin chasing a dream to Japan and back. Aaron Fischman joins me on the program. Welcome, Aaron.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So your path to this book is kind of an unusual one. This isn't like something where you discovered a topic. You came into Tony's life before all this story happens. And I want to talk a bit about that, because as I understand it, you approached him when he was in the minors in North America, well before there was any thought of him going to Japan.
Exactly. So he was a pitcher in Mobile, Alabama. I was not even close to there. I was in Davis, California, not that far from Sacramento in Northern California. I was an undergraduate. I was writing for this really small website that's been long defunct called davissportsdeli.com. And I just reached out to a handful of AA pitchers whose bios I knew nothing about other than they logged a lot of innings and had some good K to walk ratios. That was really it. And I can't remember if anyone responded. At the very least, no one responded and said yes, other than Tony. So this was through Facebook. It was a transcript interview. So I typed maybe 12 questions, sent it to him in a Facebook message. Then he got back to me with his responses in 2 or 3 days or something. We might have done another one of those. Then we did some audio podcast interviews. Then he started blogging for our site and still wasn't yet going to Japan. He blogged, for instance, about going to his first major league camp with the Arizona Diamondbacks, talked about rubbing shoulders with guys like Randy Johnson, for instance. And then he decided to go to Japan after his lone AAA season in Reno. And thankfully, he agreed to blog for us regularly. So he was doing a weekly blog. And one thing I found so fascinating, among others, was he ended up writing a blog entry for us within about 4 or so days of the devastating earthquake tsunami in Tohoku in 2011. And it was just really interesting for me to be able to read all this craziness and tragedy that was what was going on from his perspective as a foreigner in Japan. And also I was delighted to be able to relay that to our readers. But I don't need to go into the whole story, but basically over the years, we stayed in touch and his story got progressively more interesting. It had been fascinating for a long time to me, but in late 2015, once he signed with the Texas Rangers, and it appeared likely that he was going to fulfill his lifelong dream of pitching in the major leagues, that was when I knew that it would actually be marketable in the US, in North America. So I approached him early 2016 about turning it into a book. But even in 2013, when I was in grad school, I turned it into a magazine story that was never published. It was just for projects for grad school. And that was when I started interviewing people from his inner circle outside of him. So it was this long, logical progression, but over 15 years or so, I guess. It's pretty crazy. So yeah, the story evolved that way. And being in touch with him for so long allowed me to follow his story in real time. So it wasn't like I was asking all these questions years after the fact, where memories are fuzzy sometimes and other people you interview may be dishonest or yeah, they just can't remember everything. And so that I think was another really valuable tool in my arsenal, that I was doing these interviews with him in real time as things were happening to him.
So you mentioned that when he signs with the Rangers, that's when you think that there's a book because it's marketable in the U.S. Like, did you think that there was conceivably something to that journey just to Japan and like his experiences with the Yakult team? Or did you think just because I can't sell this book because it's a Japanese story?
The latter. I know that sounds a little harsh. I thought the story was so fascinating to me specifically, but I just didn't think more broadly, especially because it's in English. And of course, there are a lot of English speakers in Tokyo, but it's already a little bit of a niche topic, or niche if you prefer. But the fact that he ended up being a solid major leaguer for 3 seasons with the Texas Rangers and played parts of a fourth season with the Cubs. It wasn't just that he made his major league debut and he checked that dream off the list. It was he was actually good and a reliable middle reliever, and he proved that he could do it. But no, but really, even just when he got that contract, I thought, okay, now it's marketable in the U.S. because it's just from my thoughts and then my experience pitching prospective agents and publishers confirmed this. It's really difficult to sell a book. And so I barely was able to get a book deal from my perspective, even with his major league experience. I don't think a publisher from New York or really any small to mid-sized publisher, even in the US, would have jumped at this opportunity if he had just been a pitcher for 6 years in Japan, even a dominant pitcher in Japan, because that doesn't, his story wouldn't have really been that unique or stood out among a lot of others who pitched in Japan from the US or elsewhere in North America. But his route was just so non-traditional where he went over there in his prime, didn't expect to be there. He was about 26, had no idea he'd be there for 3 or 4 seasons, let alone six. And on the wrong side of 30, he gets his first opportunity in the major leagues and he makes the most of it. So I thought all those things contributed to making it marketable, but I don't want to knock the 6 years in Japan. That was an exhilarating, life-changing experience for him that he's so grateful for. And he loved it so much that he still is a part of their organization now, working as a scout in Arizona. But yeah, to be honest, I don't think if he had not made that major league debut ever and gotten that opportunity, I don't think I would have gotten a chance to get a publishing deal in the US.
You mentioned that obviously going to Japan is not a unique experience. There are multiple Gaijin who play, and there, despite being called a baseball Gaijin and this being Tony's story principally, there are other baseball Gaijin that you incorporate into the book. How important was it to tell like Aaron Guill's story or Dentona's story, like to incorporate that and talk to them?
Really important for me, and I think initially my thought on it was I was a little bit maybe being too ambitious, where I wanted it to be kind of a biography of all of them, where it's just centered around Tony Barnett and he's the driving force of the narrative, but it's kind of an ensemble cast. And it did end up being that way. But he ended up being more central just because um, it just worked better. And I had such close, unfettered access to him and his inner circle. And I just think his story is the most fascinating of all of those. But I've read books in the past. Astro Ball by Ben Reiter is one example, but there's so many where writers tell these fascinatingly interesting, spectacular stories where there are many important members of the cast, you could say. They're really critical to the story, but if you don't take a step back and delve into the context of how where they're introduced to the story, I feel like it doesn't have the substance or depth. And it's kind of just like you're throwing all these random people into the fire and saying, that person's a friend of Tony, that person's a teammate. But the audience then doesn't understand how and why that person ended up in Japan and how the journey went for them. And it doesn't go together to weave this intricate fabric of the story. It's kind of just like you're just telling one person's story in a vacuum. And I just think it's not as layered or as interesting of a story. So I really like when I read that in other books. That's what I was really trying to do with this one. And I don't think those asides, if you will, are tangents at all. I think they are important to the story. They strengthen the story. And I loved doing those. It wasn't just teammates like Aaron Guile and Jamie D'Antona. It was also David Watkins, the British expat, for instance, who calls himself a Swallows super fan and started and maintained the English language fan site, TokyoSwallows.com. I think getting that fan perspective was really cool, or getting the reporter perspective from Canadian Rob Small. So I didn't want to just do players. Getting the interpreter perspective from Go Fujisawa, or the agent perspective from Don Nomura. But anyway, that's a long rambling answer, but I like that you asked me about that because that was something that I derived a lot of pleasure from, was telling those backstories too.
You mentioned Astroball there. How cognizant were you of other people's writing and works when you were writing this? Like, were you thinking about, things that you enjoyed in other people's books, or like structural things that you appreciated as a reader?
That's a really good question. I don't actively think about other works when I'm researching and reporting, but as with I think everyone, I have things that inspire me, that shape the type of reporter or writer that I am. And I've just read a lot in the past, particularly a lot of sports and political biographies. And just when I read things, there are things I like, things I don't like. And I don't actively say to myself, you should be doing this because this technique or approach was used in X book, for example, but it's more of like an unconscious thing that I think I'm just a product of all of my experiences, and I bring my own biased opinions to the table too, what I think works, what I think doesn't. So I think that no one will read my book and say, "Oh, that's exactly like someone else writes," or whatever. But I do think and hope that they'll see certain techniques or similarities. Maybe if they've read other stuff in the genre. Another thing though that some people have told me is more unique with my book is that, and it was important for me to do, was talking about some of the macro factors that play with regard to the earthquake and tsunami, for instance, how I had a couple middle chapters where the first one was really, I would say, micro, where it's all these anecdotes from Tony and the supporting cast, where they were when the earthquake hit, how they got in touch with their loved ones, for instance, what media they were consuming or whatever. And then the second one takes more of a step back and talks about the lives lost and the recovery effort and return to play situation with the league and certain owners in the Central League, led by the Yomiuri Giants owner, trying to hurry them back to play to get butts and seats and sell tickets, and the controversy over that. Things like pensioners volunteering to go into areas to measure radioactivity level and stuff, and protests on nuclear energy. So all these things I think are way more important than baseball and sports in a vacuum. So it was really important for me to tell what I felt was like a weightier story, where sports is so important, and I talk about that in that chapter. It can inspire people, it can bring people in a country together, and it's so important. But in a vacuum, the X's and O's and what happens on the field and in the box score is so insignificant when you put it next to people losing their lives, or the lives of their loved ones, or losing their home. But like I said, sports is so important. Like how I talk about the women's soccer team in Japan helping bring that country together and giving them hope when they needed it the most. So that was really important for me. And I know you didn't exactly ask about that, and I'm kind of veering off here on a tangent, but that is something that some people have told me was a little bit unique about this story, that it's a little bit in places a little sociological and talking about what the government and the media are doing and stuff. And it's not just, okay, I'm following this player and having quotes from him and talking about his stats and what he did on this game, on this date, and okay, he had this injury when. It's less of like just baseball stats and information, I guess you could say. And I was trying to do that for it to be more relatable and have universal themes that, say, someone who's not necessarily a baseball or a sports fan could relate to. So that's what I was trying to do with this book.
Well, it definitely provides context. Like when you talk about, coming out of the earthquake, that the changes to the rules around like the time limit on games, and the games were being held during the day to conserve energy because they didn't need to light the ballpark and things like that. Like that provides a context and an explanation for like what was going on. And then even that, like, that changes the routine for the players, right? Because you talked to Tony about like how routinized his schedule was and how he performed well under that routine. Well, it gets shaken up.
Exactly, 100%. Yeah.
I'm very interested in process. And so in the acknowledgments, you talk about going through a critical review and analysis of the manuscript with Kevin Anderson and Associates after an agent says, the book is just simply too long. I'm curious if you can kind of like explain what that process is like.
Definitely. So before I even got involved with them, so I'll take a step back. There was this prospective agent I reached out to named Stephanie Evans, and it's a difficult process. So a lot of times you're not hearing anything back from people, or they'll pass on the project. So I was trying to get representation by an agent at that time. And she was one of the rare people who responded and said, "Whoa, I think you have a story here. I'm fascinated by it, but your word count is way too long. So I'm going to recommend this guy that I like, and he has this company. His name's Mark Weinstein. He's worked with so many sports books, particularly baseball, and you should reach out to him to see if he can help you refine your story, make it shorter, because it's just too long." And nowadays, she didn't say this, but I've learned that, I mean, attention spans are shrinking, and the average length of most books, particularly nonfiction sports books, supposedly is something like 80,000 words. And I think I said it was 110,000 in my pitch. And even before that, I had been cutting it. It was on pace to be something ridiculous, like 500 pages. That's confusing because now it's listed at 424, but not to go into too much minutia, but it's like 20 of those are indexed, 20 are bibliography. So I feel like that's really misleading to say that my book is in the 400s. It feels like more of like a 330 page book or something. But anyway, so it was on pace to be ridiculously long before I even got in touch with her, but still 110,000 was still seen as way too long. I had various meetings, virtual meetings on Zoom or whatever with this guy, Mark Weinstein, and he was really helpful. I grew to trust him really quickly. So I ended up paying them to assign an editor. There was one that he handpicked who has written sports books and edited them as well, Matt Silverman. And what he did was he read the book from start to finish in its current form, and he just marked it up like crazy. And I mean, as a perfectionist and someone who's been working on a book for years, naturally there were so many things I disagreed with, and then certain things that it really helped to have an outside eye. Like oh wow, I never thought about that. I really should be more clear about my wording with that, or that's more for ego purposes included, but it's not really serving the purpose of the narrative as well. So I should cut that and just be less attached to it. So that process was really, really valuable to me. And it wasn't intimidating or jarring because all of these edits were optional. I could choose whatever I wanted to implement or not. And it would be a pretty complete waste of money and time if I didn't implement any. And I ended up implementing, I don't know, maybe like 30 to 40% of them in some manner. And I think that's a lot. But most importantly, it got me thinking about like the cliche that it's your baby. It was my first book. I was so close and attached to everything, protective over every little thing because I had done so much researching and reporting. And as a baseball nerd and a journalism nerd, I thought, oh, this is gold. It's so interesting. And I love this. But like I was saying, there are things, if I was being honest with myself, if I took a step back, I would say it's not necessarily serving the narrative well, and the average reader wouldn't notice that it wasn't included. And not only would the narrative not suffer from omitting it, it would actually strengthen it because it would be tighter and more focused. So there were a number of things like that. One example was Yuhei Takai, who ended up just shortening it to Yuhei. It was kind of like a Rick Ankiel type, where he was a left-handed pitcher who was up and coming, promising, and just got a case of the yips and never was able to regain his control. So he went to the minors and was converted into a power hitting outfielder. And I delved really deeply into that backstory. And I still included a little bit in the story, but it didn't need to be 3 pages worth. It needed to be like a paragraph. worth. So that's an example of something that it wasn't so bad once I just let go. But Kevin Anderson and Associates and going through that process really, I mean, I'm always going to have an ego as a writer and someone whom this is so important to, but it allowed me to put my ego aside more and say it's okay to cut a lot of these things. And really, it's just as good, if not better now that it's tighter. So I then got down to something like 90,000 words or something, or closer, or maybe even it got under that. But then there were other things that added up, like the foreword and epilogue and stuff. But anyway, so that was then more in the range. And then reached back out to Stephanie Evans, and she wasn't interested. And that's just how it goes sometimes. But I was so grateful for her connecting me to Mark Weinstein, and it really helped the story a lot, I think. And I do wish that I learned earlier in the process, and I should have been, I don't know, less tunnel visioned on writing the story I wanted to do, and learned better about what the word count range would be. It would have saved me a lot of time and effort, maybe, but it could have been a blessing in disguise that I wrote this crazy long book, and then I could fine tune it down from there, because I then ended up researching and reporting so widely that it's easier to cut things than to add things you don't have. So
it's kind
I
of
don't
like
know.
Tony discovering a splitter in some ways, right? That you didn't know that you needed to kind of hone in on this pitch, but you found out, afterwards I've been working on this thing, and if I tweak it a little bit, it'll be better. And that's that edit process, it sounds like.
I like that parallel. That's a good metaphor. Yeah.
You'd mentioned, the average reader in that answer, and thinking about the average reader. How much thought did you give about the fact that, like, not everyone knows the NPB, and like how much you have to explain, like, Ichigun and like demotions and things like that?
That was definitely at the forefront of my mind. I mean, I didn't understand a lot of this until I started digging in and researching and reporting. So if I don't know, as the writer, then most readers, I think, are not going to know. But then there are other considerations that I had, like, do I have to explain what a double switch is? Or what, I don't know, just specific baseball stuff. And I don't really remember. I think I came to some happy medium, because as you, I'm sure you noticed, I have a lot of endnotes. That I think that's a good example. So because I'm writing for various audiences, and I'm aware of that. So there are, for lack of a better term, baseball nerds like me, I guess, that want to know all those fun facts. This is the first time since 1977 that X has happened or whatever, or add an extra quote that didn't fit into the narrative and was more of a fun thing, but I kind of wanted it to be somewhere in the book. So I had footnotes originally, and there was pushback from the publisher, and I deferred to them because they have expertise in doing this, and they didn't want to get rid of my footnotes. They just wanted to move them to the ends of chapters. And so I thought that was a really good compromise, because if you put these notes at the end of the book, it's a lot harder to flip all the way to the end. It's less fresh in your mind if you're one of those nerds like me that wants to read the notes. And then, of course, if you're more of a casual reader, or you're one of those readers who isn't necessarily a baseball or sports fan, as I alluded to, and you're reading for the inspirational thread, or the aspect of being a foreigner in a land that you're unfamiliar with, and how you navigate that, then I think those readers don't really care in most cases about reading the footnotes or endnotes. So I thought that was a good compromise, that we put those notes at the end of each chapter as opposed to on the bottom of each page, or at the very end of the book. So that's an example of me trying to write for multiple audiences. And I tried to do that throughout, where I'm not doing so much play by play, where a more casual reader would be more likely to tune out. But by the same on the other end of things, on the other side of the coin, I do want to have it be substantive enough for the baseball fanatic, where I'm building up this exciting play-by-play. For instance, if it's at the end of a critical playoff game, you kind of need to know what happened leading up to the ninth inning where Tony's in the game. And
what does Tony think of the book?
Tony is excited and happy about it. And it's interesting because Tony, I don't know how to explain it. He's a showman in some ways, as anyone who ever watched him, and I think people who read the book will know this too. He he's very intense and emotional on the mound and off at times, but also he likes to perform. But then there's a duality to him where he doesn't always like being the center of attention. So he has this humility. It's humility, maybe also part insecurity. I don't know. But I think it's more humility. But it's do people, am I really special? Is my story that inspirational? Do people really want to hear this? And why am I any different than anyone else? And he's said this in some interviews, but then when he gets the reception and the feedback from people who read it and or people who are already in his life who didn't know all the stuff that was going on behind the scenes, it serves as if I can speak for him, just going based off of what I've heard him tell me directly and in recent interviews, it serves as validation, like, okay, yeah, it did make sense for me to tell this story to Aaron over these many years and be patient with the process that at times felt like it was never ending and give this unfettered access. Like it was all worth it. I did go on this amazing journey that sometimes I downplay in my mind out of humility or for whatever reason. And I'm grateful that we did this, that this process unfolded. And you could tell he's also really excited to do more media. He's been doing a lot of interviews to just help spread the word and get this book that both of us are really proud of out there more. And on that note, one thing that I forgot to mention that I wanted to note is we're currently doing a giveaway contest where Tony has signed baseball cards, and I'll be signing books as well. We'll both be signing books. And he wore number 43 with the Rangers and 34 with the Swallows. And so 34 of the next 43 hard copies sold through August 17th will be winning either a second signed book or signed baseball cards by Tony. So basically 80% or more of people who purchase a hardcover over these next couple weeks will be entered into a chance of winning. So that's one thing I wanted people to be aware of. And all they would really have to do is just send me on social media by Aaron Fish, Fisch, on Instagram or X, or find me on Facebook, proof of purchase, and then post 1 to 3 sentences on a social media platform of your choosing on why you're excited to read the book. Those are the only two requirements to be entered into it.
Well, there you go. It's Tony's story, but Aaron Fischman is the one who wrote it. A Baseball Gaijin, Chasing a Dream to Japan and Back is out now. Aaron, thanks very much for taking some time, and congrats on the release of the book.
My pleasure. I thought you asked really thought-provoking questions about the process, and it was enjoyable for me to go back into that time and share what happened with you.